Season 2 is finally among us, guys.
What is being married like?
Yeah, we've been married for 1.5 years now. For me, I forget. Thanks, Fiance.
And I'm excited for this new adventure of Season 2. Let's go.
Yay.
Hello again. I'm Beth, and I'm here with Leiji, Naomi, and Sion. And we are here for yet another episode of Girl Talk, which is one of our favorite things to do, is to be girls and to talk.
Yeah.
Today, I'm interested about this topic. I mean, I'm interested in all the topics. We want to talk about culture. And I think this is a really interesting one for us because we are from, well, you guys are from different countries and have grown up in different countries. And so I'm just going to go right in with asking some questions, if that's okay with you ladies.
Please. It's wonderful. Love it, Beth.
Thanks, Naomi. Sion, you were born in Ethiopia.
Correct.
You grew up in Canada. You live in England.
Yeah.
What nationality do you identify as? What's your culture?
That's a good question because I do sometimes catch myself. Who am I?
Yeah.
So, yes. So it's funny because I grew up in a white family, Dutch white family. So there's things where I picked up from being in that family. But inside, even when I'm with them, it's funny because when I'm with my family, I feel so different. Like, you know, like the way I think, how I see the world is so different. And then when I'm with, like, I say Africans, I still somehow feel like, I was definitely raised with like white people. But I think I feel the most in my skin when I am with like Africans. Because not only, because like growing up in small town Chilliwack, it's just like not many people look like me, you know? So I think that had a huge part to play even in my identity in that. And then, so I think when I'm around Africans, it's like, oh, like, you know, we have something in common and like I look like them, you know? And so I had to kind of overcome a lot of things, you know, accepting myself for who I am and saying I'm just very uniquely, you know, created, you know, and all these kind of things. So, I'm a mix. Like but I think there's, and I know when I'm with Africans, there's things I'm definitely like, definitely grew up in a white family, you know, or in a Canadian culture.
And what is it when you're with Africans? Is it just the color of your skin that you're?
It's not even just the color of the skin. I think it's just like it's like the music. Like I love dancing, you know. It's just the smallest things. Just like I think, even though like I grew up in a Dutch family that's like direct communication, but like it's a different kind of direct communication. And it's just, I think I just feel like I can just be fully me. And like I, you know, my stories, like even like with sharing stories and stuff like that. And then I feel, because I'm a very strong, independent Black woman, you know, and so then where that I feel like I can be that with Africans. So it's that independency of like, you just kind of get on, you know, and stuff like that. So I think there's just so many different aspects of it.
And when you're living in England now, have you kind of overcome that feeling of feeling different and being?
For sure. Like, again, I think England, like when I was little, I've always wanted to live abroad. I wanted to live somewhere where there's many different variety of people, different backgrounds. And so when I came to England, it's very diverse, right? So here I feel at home. Like I feel like I'm not like, oh my gosh, I'm so different. Even like where we live on our campus, like is so diverse, you know, and there's just so many people that look like me or like, you know, or look different or even think differently, you know? And so I think for myself, England, I think England has such a special place in my heart because that's where I've grew to accepting myself.
Right.
And I think a lot of those identity struggles that I faced is I've overcome that in England.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Wow. Yeah. And Leiji, you were born in Brazil and you were raised there and now you live in England. And how do you find you either relate or don't relate to English culture and being in this nation?
I came to England, I was 21, if I'm not wrong. And I am about to turn 28 right now. Like, oh my gosh. But I feel that I became an adult here in England. So a lot of how that happened and my growth and maturity came in this culture. I feel that in some situations and context, I feel quite a lot related to how the English culture do things.
Yeah.
Not fully, has no way that could be. But even when I'm with my Brazilian friends or with my family, sometimes the way that I would talk to them, they're just like, wow, you just sound so not English, because they don't know much about the culture, but they just say like, you sound so like from out there, or like a gringa. Because for Brazilians, like anybody that is not from Brazil, they will say gringo or gringa. And they're like, oh, you sound some gringa, or sound so gringo. So
is it difficult if your family see you kind of maybe as, do they see you as a little separate?
No, not at all. Like they're chill about that. They're cool. They find it funny in some situations. They know that it's been 6-7 years that we've been here, so they know that change happened.
Right.
So we don't have that difficulty. They make fun of me, but in a light way. It's just the Brazilian culture. It's a lot of like, if you're close, if you're friends, we're gonna make fun of situations. We're gonna laugh about the circumstances in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, we'll talk to everybody. Naomi,
Just keep it going in a circle.
Naomi, you're half English, half American.
Yes.
You lived a year in Tanzania.
Yeah.
What's that like?
Living in it's I think I am very confused when it comes to culture, to be honest. So it's really even interesting. I'm sitting here and like, I find it interesting hearing from people who I feel have maybe a better grip of culture and the way that it can actually impact. And I think the reason that I do is because I also grew up my parents worked for this charity that we work for, Youth with a Mission. And so I've grown up surrounded by, up to 100 people from probably like 20 to 30 different countries, traveled a lot with my families. I've already been to over 30 countries, and then always had that dynamic as well of, yes, my dad is American, but we live in England. My mum is actually not English. She's from the island Jersey off the Channel Islands. And so she says, I'm British, but I'm not English. And I think then some other things of, living in Tanzania for a year when I was 3, 4, 5 kind of age. And also I was homeschooled until I was 13. So then I joined public school from kind of 13 onwards. So for me, there's a lot with culture that it's like, I actually just don't see or understand culture because I think I have never really clearly felt that I am this one thing or have had this like really clear identity within my culture. And I think growing up as well with so many different cultures and seeing the mix of them all together, sometimes I find it hard to like think about things a bit more like clearly segregated into, well, segregated probably isn't the right word, but kind of like boxed into like, oh, this is what an English person is like, because I don't know, again, it's an interesting thing that I'd almost like to hear more of your opinions on, because I'm like, so often you can have the stereotypes of kind of what a culture is, but then you always meet people from those cultures who really don't fit that, you know? And it's not just the one-off. There's like a lot of Brazilians that I've met who've been like, oh yeah, I'm not a typical Brazilian, you know? So then I'm like, well then is it actually a typical Brazilian or is it just, I don't know.
It's the stereotype. As we are using the Brazilian example, I'll say I am an introvert. And a lot of this stereotype of a Brazilian is like, we're gonna be friends with everybody. Like everything is just a party. It's celebration and like has no bad time, you know. Oh, you don't need to let me know when you come to my house. You just come in, like you just knock at the door and go, just
have a seat,
walk in and sit it. You know, it is. I find it sometimes necessary when I meet new people and then they are like, oh my gosh, I love Brazilians. Like Brazilians are the best. I'm like, thank you. But also I'm not the typical stereotype of Brazilian. Like I'm not like that out there. Because one thing that is very common, it's because in Brazil, you're in the line to buy bread, let's say. People start talking about like their deep feelings and like family history with someone they never met before. They just met 2 minutes ago in the line where they're waiting for the bread. And it's just like this big thing. So sometimes it's like Brazilians are all like, boom, and we can talk and we can. But actually, I found it very difficult to go deep in a long-term friendship because it's always very superficial.
Yeah.
It's that one boom thing
Yeah.
on that moment.
So I have a question for you. Like, so you're saying like you're not the typical Brazilian, and so often you heard like Brazilians like to party, and like, you know, everybody comes in.
I love to party, by the way.
Like to party, but like, you know,
She's like,
like
I'll keep that,
everybody
I'll
just
keep that.
comes in, or like we're best friends right away. So what was that like for you being a Brazilian that's different when you lived in Brazil? Like, how did that affect you?
It was a shock for me understanding I was an introvert.
Right.
Exactly for that reason. My mom's side of the family, like my mom's family, I would say we are, because I'll include myself on that. We are very loud and we talk a lot. So every time the family is together, it's Eduardo jokes that the ceiling could come down because of how loud and noisy that part of the family is. But it's just like once we are together, that thing happens.
Yeah.
But I never realized before the reason why I felt exhausted afterwards.
Right.
So yes, I love to be around that side of my family. Like we can be loud and we talk and we laugh and all of that. But because I'm an introvert, I need time to rest apart. I need my own time.
Yeah.
And I sometimes in Brazil, I think it's something that is coming up now. It's not, I don't know, a few years ago, I never heard about being an introvert or extrovert.
Right.
It's just the right thing. It's to be social. It's to be present when someone is in your house. You know, if you're a teenager and then you're not like hosting whoever is in your house because your parents are having people, oh my gosh, like they're being moody and they are being teenagers, you know?
Right.
When actually of course, when we are teenagers, we can kind of just want to like, don't want to be around people. But also, I didn't know that time that I needed off was because I had to recharge.
Yeah.
And then only when I was outside my culture, I was outside of my family, I understood that I was an introvert. And looking back now, my dad is an introvert and I never knew about that. I never realized. My mom is a very extrovert. She's very active and I love spending time with my mom. Like I really get into it. But at the same time, sometimes I need that time to rest. And I can kind of get it, like seeing my dad. Eduardo said, like, you look just like your dad in the morning. When we are at my parents' house, like my dad leaves the room, he just sits down, he had his cup of coffee or whatever, he's just drinking and being quiet. And the first time Eduardo saw that, he would look at me and look at my dad, look at me and look at my dad. I was like, wow, you're just like, look just so much like each other.
Because I have a Brazilian friend, and when she came to England, she realized, wow, like I can just have my time by myself. She realized, she's like, I think I'm an introvert because the culture is so extroverted, like it comes off, you know? And so when she came here, she's just like, I don't feel bad, like just to wanting to have my time by myself because that's actually acceptable. Like it's not acceptable, but she realized that she's more introverted. But because I think she was surrounded, like, you know, when when she's like, oh, I'm worried to go to Brazil because I know my parents will have like 100 people over and stuff. So it's kind of interesting when you come out of that you realize like, oh, like I'm actually like, I am introvert, but here I feel like it's okay for me to, you know.
I feel that it's easier for me to put on boundaries here. It can also be the fact I'm older, I'm mature, you know, I know more about myself. But I feel, I don't know, maybe you guys can say more about like you, Beth, you're from England. So I don't know, I have the feeling I can have this freedom of putting a boundary without being like, oh my gosh, you don't want to socialize.
No, absolutely. You know? I mean, I would say I'm one British person, but I would say that I think it's quite normal it's almost offensive if you're not respecting somebody's boundaries and you're not like thinking. You have to kind of, I feel like we often are very over careful not to oh, you're tired. No, I won't come over. No, I'll let you be, you know, I'll let you, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big part of our culture here. But I don't know, I feel like the more I get to know other cultures, it's always the more you learn about your own culture.
Yeah, maybe.
So
but
true.
I feel like the more I learn about maybe British culture. And it might be this thing of maybe it's more about personalities. The more I feel not so British, you know, like, or I mean, I don't always relate to how my family is. Like, I think my family is sociable, but I'm apparently a different level. Whereas I'm like, and I think it's where I've grown up in this context now of being in Youth of the Mission.
Yeah.
Of being around people all the time and living in community. That's just a completely different culture.
Yeah.
It's not really about being English or not, or Brazilian or not, Canadian or not. Living in community is a completely different culture to not living in community. And I think that's something that I really enjoy. But obviously there's challenges, and we all work with different cultures all the time. So what are some things that you find like challenging about? Have you noticed conflicts that have happened where you've put it down to cultural differences? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm trying to think.
I think one of the biggest one that I've realized is communication. Like how, you know, I come from like world direct communication, right? So I think
Dutch,
and which, so I'm used to that. So whether I pick that up, again, being with the family, or if that's who I am, I think for me, it's just like the, you know, indirect communication. So I think that kind of maybe brought some conflicts. So I think that's like probably one of the big ones, and just even how to dealing with conflicts. What does that look like, you know? So I think those are two ones that I was like, wow, like I am learning a lot, you know? So
Again, I think I just don't see it.
Yeah.
So weird. Like I just don't. And sometimes I'm like, there's the frustration of like, should I see it more clearly? I don't know. Like, I think there's even an element of what you were saying of, obviously I recognize I've grown up most of my life in England, and most of my life in the same environment, the same kind of like town in England. But still there's also like, the element of me always being surrounded by people from other countries and who've traveled often also to lots of other countries, and they're living in a country sometimes that's not their own. And then I think also the increased diversity that you find like in London or places like that in England is, to me, sometimes it's just really hard to know often for me, because I'm like, I think there's this thing of like culture is there, but then also culture adapts. And even within one nation or one country, you could find that there's a culture that's different or stereotypically different in the south of the country than there is in the north of the country. So I know a typical one that at least I hear with like the UK would be like the north is much more hospitable, much more friendly, much more kind of relational. And then the south is more task oriented and more kind of rushing through things to get work done. And I don't know, more private maybe even sometimes. But I think because I really am a person, and this is also part of my personality probably, where it's like I really like there to be a really clear like this or that. And if I can't find things that fit into the clear this or that category, and I find that there are inconsistencies, then I just kind of am like, all right, I'm in the gray, you know? So again, I think for me, I could say a lot on personality differences of working with people who I recognize have different personalities and the way that impacts. But for some reason, I find it really hard to attribute things to culture. And maybe part of that is even because I feel like I don't understand the culture that I currently live in well enough. And I also don't think I understand other people's cultures well enough to really know I don't know what to weigh things against.
Right. Yeah.
I'm an odd one in that way.
Yeah.
I think my dad even would have much more of a stronger sense of culture.
Yeah.
And it's something that I'm curious about, because I'm like, I even wonder, is there something with, as we become more and more interconnected, even with things like social media and the internet, is like I'm seeing stuff from people all over the world online, and I'm being inspired by things all over the world online. Fashion, you know, like art, music, like it's so accessible.
Yeah.
That it, in some ways, I'd be interested to see, is there an element almost of that global connection that means that the lines of culture sometimes get a bit more blurred.
Right.
But maybe do you think what you've also staffed discipleship training schools where you've had different cultures? That's when I see it the most, because it's the first time different cultures normally are coming together to live with other cultures.
Yeah.
And so, for example, right now I'm working quite closely with a lot of South Americans, someone from Scandinavia, from Switzerland, and a couple from Asian cultures,
Yeah.
from Korea and from Thailand.
Yeah.
And so I really clearly see their cultural differences when they're communicating. The way they eat together is very different. And we've got, all these different mixes. The way they eat together, the way they would talk, the way they would communicate, the way they would process, the way they're physically affectionate with one another. And it's not just their personality, it's definitely their culture, because it's definitely more of a South American trait to be more physically affectionate. And that's not to say people outside of that aren't, but I would say like the Scandinavian and the one I've got from Switzerland are way less physically affectionate. And I can definitely put that down to their culture.
Yeah.
So do you find that there's some obvious things that are maybe stereotypically more part of other cultures where you would kind of have to put it down to that?
Yeah.
I'm sure there would be some, but again, it's hard because I'm also functioning in the reality of my parents do not fit, in my opinion, very clearly the cultures that they actually were born into. So my dad is the American, my mum is the Brit, but I think most people when they meet them would assume that other than the accent, they would be the other way around. My dad is the introvert. My dad is measured. He's more private. My mum is much more outgoing, much more relational, much more bringing people together, go with the flow. And so, and even less kind of like time oriented, you know? And so I think for me, again, it's like, maybe it's my personal, and I think it very much is probably my personal, life experience is like, even that for me is where I've grown up, where I'm like, okay, so that is, my dad is not at all what I think people would stereotypically say is American. If anything, my mum would be more American than my dad in some things. So but I'd like to hear from you guys, because I think even what you're saying, Beth, is you've seen some of those things, and I don't know, I feel like maybe, as I said, I'm a bit more muddled in my experience with it. So that's why I'm so curious even to hear from you guys a bit more of those things that you do see as being a bit clearer.
Yeah. I think I'm like in between you guys, because I think there's, especially where we live, that I'm working with Youth with a Mission, it's just like, what is, and I'm trying to kind of differ, like what is like culture and what is personality, you know? In certain situations, you know, you can always use, it's part of my culture. I'm like, no, this is you, you know? And so I think with you, Naomi, I think that does come from having parents that are like from certain countries, but are just like opposite. That's probably because you grew up seeing that. You're like, this is more like just personality. And so I can see why you would think that. And there's something like, I think for me, like one of the things that I've noticed is like, having cultures, like, do you have the Western culture and the like warm, like the hot culture and the warm, what is it, warm culture and cold culture? And how, like, with that, where am I going with this? My brain, guys. I'm so sorry. Is the warm and cold culture. And
usually the warm culture would be more like the South American, African culture. And then the cold culture would be
like
more
Western culture.
So when I came to England, I first came to do English school in cultural orientation. Most of the people
Beijing, you're the expert. Come on.
You got a lot of experience.
Some. But a lot of the people on that school, they were also Brazilian. And we had maybe 3 or 4. Siona was staffing that school. And we had a lot of Brazilians, but we also had this 3 or 4 other people on the team that they were not Brazilian. So sometimes we would just feel very comfortable on our own talk and things. And then this other people, they would feel left out. And then we would have to, like, the staff would come and say, you need to speak in English. You're here to learn English. You need to speak English, please. Speak English, please. By the end of the 3 months, we were like, if someone else says, speak English, please, I'm going to be. But
if the girl from Africa is picking up Portuguese, she's fluent. That means you're not speaking.
You learn how to speak Portuguese because of how much Portuguese we would say.
That's good.
But this thing about learning the cold and hot culture really helps you to understand a lot. And it's not saying that whoever comes from the hot culture will be warmer and nicer. It's nothing to do with that. It's really this category and these things that gets involved. Like a lot of Brazilians, I would say, because that's where I can say for sure. A lot of Brazilians are very punctual, and they really they appreciate when people are on time, and they are like really working on deadlines. But it's something that sometimes on warm culture, it's this thing about what really matters is like, you know, that we are having the right time and a good time. Like, we passed the time that was supposed to end. It's fine, you know.
Yeah.
But then for who have the culture background, usually we'll say like, we are having a good time, but it's 5 o'clock. We need to end this right now.
Yeah.
You know, but it can also, and then comes personality and all of that. But it has also that thing. Yeah. This perspective.
And I think as you're speaking, that's came to mind now. Is there? It doesn't mean one culture is better than the other. It's just different, you know. And I think it's not one is, you know, oh, this is the way, or like, you know. I think it's just different. And I think being in YWAM with Youth with Mission, I learned so much. It's just like, you know, Western culture is not better than, you know, South American culture or whatever, you know, because just like you learn so much from each culture. And I was just like, and each culture has this beauty. You know,
absolutely.
You know, and so they bring something that you like. And I learned so much about God through cultures. Like, oh my gosh, like, you know, and how you do music, food, all that kind of stuff.
You can see God's character. In every
very
culture
colorful.
You meet. Like you can see very clear, like so much of God in each one. But also, I think we as a Christians, we should search and go for a live in the culture of the kingdom. And it's something that really helps when you need to go through conflicts with like the way you communicate or really understanding each other's heart and intention with that. It's being open to know that maybe what it means for you doesn't mean to the other person. And trying to have a better communication, understanding that we are all, you know, we love God. I mean, when you are in the context that we live, we are all Christians, right? So then when we need to go through conflict, that is something that helps to do it. But of course, when you're not on this, when you're having conflict with someone that is not Christian, you still can look through that situation with the kingdom's culture. You can use those lenses to also help you.
I guess my question with that, it would be, how do you actually know what is kingdom culture? Because I feel like we'll often use this term where we're like, we're not just this culture, we're not that culture, we're kingdom culture. But then I'm like, but then who decides
which
what
culture
that
decides
is?
that?
And how do we really understand that, and how does that play out then?
It's true.
Because surely there could still be some kingdom culture that expresses itself slightly differently in different environments or through different people's personalities or things like that. So I'm always curious, because I'm like, I hear this thing of kingdom culture, but where do we find that, and what does that actually look like?
And I think it's true. We have to maybe sometimes careful when we're using that terminology, because it's true. We've all grown up with different cultures and mindsets from our nationalities or from our families or from our churches that would make our idea of what kingdom culture is. But I guess at the end of the day, what it's saying is we want to be acting in love always. And that means sometimes, let's say my idea of loving somebody as a classic example is turning up on time if they invite me over for dinner. Whereas a different culture, loving that person might, I'm going to come 10 minutes late to give my host some time to get things ready. And it's not thinking, oh, they're not showing kingdom culture because they're coming late. It's assuming the best of that person as well. And also just being like, oh, okay, like I'm going to love that person. I'm going to hear them out. I'm going to ask these questions. And it's not about whether it's right or wrong. It's about love at the end of the day. But also culture, as I said, we talk about culture as a nationalities, but it's so part. You've got a family culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
We often talk about how your family's culture is very unique
and a strong family culture.
So you have a very strong family culture, and we have different cultures, and that's the nice thing when we start to grow up and we have our own families. We get to create our own culture, our home culture, and it's the first kind of way of discipleship that we have is when we have families. But I think we are all a product of the culture we've grown up in, and maybe your culture is YWAM culture, you know, because you've grown up with so many different nationalities.
Very fascinating mixture of cultures.
But I guess you've grown up with, you know, YWAM culture, but you've also grown up with British culture. You've gone to school, you've worn a uniform, you've had those cultures as you go. And I think it's good to be open and to be learning all of them. As Leiji was saying, God did not give all of his attributes to one nationality.
Yeah.
And the more we
So
get to
true.
know other nationalities and cultures, the more we get to know God.
I think one time, this is funny, we had something at our campus and we had a bunch of Africans come in and we were dancing and Naomi was part of that circle and she was dancing and I remember looking at my African friends like, oh, she's one of us. Look at her go.
It's the 1 year I lived in Tanzania.
She learned all her moves there. No, it's
true.
good.
Yeah, I do love African music.
Yes.
They've got good rhythm,
I do
people.
too. That's
It's
so
fun.
good.
And I think that's such a blessing. Like, we are so blessed with the way we live, living with so many
Honestly.
different cultures and nationalities, because I would never have got to try all the Brazilian food I've got to eat
Yeah.
if I hadn't have lived
So
in this
good.
culture, or I would
Yeah.
not have got to learn like different arts that Asian cultures have. And there's just so much that I've learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so many different richness in languages as well. Even being married to a Swedish guy, I've learned so much about the Swedish culture, which I just love, and I really take that on as part of my culture now.
I think like for me, I like as you're saying, I feel so blessed to live in this in this world where I get to see so many cultures. Because when I was a little girl, I remember we drove to the city and I was just like, oh, Mom, look at her. Oh, she looks so different. Oh. And then my mom's like, you really like culture, don't you? I'm like, I just love it. And I think that comes from being from a different culture, right? And so just how like God orchestrated me to come into like YWAM and just be with so many different cultures is like, oh, dream come true.
Yeah. Well, we've gone around in a few circles.
Yeah.
We've talked about basically how we're all from different cultures, but we're all one and the same. And how good it is to be learning about other cultures and nationalities. And I've enjoyed this topic. It's something that we're all kind of interested in.
Yeah.
And we're all a part of working with different cultures and nationalities all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
For chatting and for
Yeah.
sharing and for listening.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.